Hello and a very warm welcome to Bruegel's podcast, The Sound of Economics. My name is Guntram Wolf and I'm the director of Bruegel. I'm very pleased to host today Luc van Middelaar, who is an eminent scholar and who has actually just published a wonderful book called Pandemonium, and he will explain to us what that means and what is the main thesis of his book. And we want to engage in a conversation around the book, which really is about the last 2 years of the European Union and how the European Union got through this coronavirus crisis. And with me today is also Maria de Mertzis, Bruegel's deputy director, and she will, together with me, co-host today's debate, add questions and her perspectives on the issue. And so we very much look forward to the 35 minutes that we have now to get into your book. For people that haven't read the book yet, perhaps you can start kicking us off. What's the main point you want to make in the book? And what does the title mean also, Pandemonium?
Yes, thank you, Guntram and Maria. The book is called Pandemonium, Saving Europe, and it's basically about the EU's response to the COVID crisis, economic and public health response. And by the way, I'm very pleased to present it here at Bruegel because, at least for the English edition, we have a Bruegel on the cover, right? Whether you've seen it or whether you just have seen the PDF, but it has a nice Bruegel on the cover, which...
Oh, the other Bruegel, you mean?
I actually have that picture in my office as a background, so I was very pleased to see that picture, and thanks for the double Bruegel.
Well, it also links up a little bit to the title, at least to the atmosphere of the title. To this, of course, Pandemonium is the capital of hell in Milton's Paradise Lost, so it's not the most joyful of images, and it. In a way, in the book, it refers to the very early stages of the COVID outbreak in Europe when we were witnessing, let's say, hellish scenes, really, from hospitals, people dying on the corridors, all these kinds of very, very black images. But Pandemonium obviously also has a more figurative sense of a lot of noise, public cabal, even debate and conflict. And it is one of the main arguments in the book that from that initial experience of bitterness and also conflict at the outbreak within the European Union, experience of vulnerability and public debate, also arose rather unexpectedly a more robust response than many had foreseen in terms of an economic response with the Corona Recovery Funds. We can get to that. But there was a second, also very far-reaching, if perhaps not as revolutionary, decision that was also taken within a few months after that outbreak of March 2020, and which was a decision to do a joint vaccine purchase. The heart of the book is a chronicle of the crisis and the EU's response on these various fronts, public health, economy, and also with the geopolitical dimension and the backdrop of Europe's realization of what was going on between China and the United States. But I also place this response of Europe, let's say, in an overall framework of how I look at the European Union and the way it is able, or also sometimes unable, to respond to crisis, and how in a series of, shocks, which you at Bruegel have chronicled as well since the start of the financial crisis in 2008, the European Union has been forced to transform itself to what I call, in my language, from an entity basically doing politics of rules, market building, etc., to a political order which, alongside that, also has to be able to deal with certain threats and dangers. And in that respect, the pandemic was a kind of test, a real-life test about what the European Union is able to do and what not. And it is, in my view, in these moments, real moments of truth, that you discover the weaknesses and strengths of a political order. Just, by the way, as in private life, you also discover in moments of crisis whom you can rely on and whom not, etc. So it's just very instructive. That's and right. A lot of very important things, I think, happened, which have changed and will continue to change the European Union.
There's a very funny say which says, if you have a small heart attack, you can make life-changing your everyday practice. But a small one, it doesn't kill you, but it really makes you change. So maybe we can describe Europe as a series of small heart attacks because we're still alive. And we are actually made interesting preference changes in our lifestyle. But let me go back to your title, Luke, because that's actually... It's also a play on the pandemic, no? Is it?
Well, yeah, obviously, I forgot to mention the most obvious. I'm a writer at heart, so I couldn't resist the pun, obviously.
Yeah, that's right. And it's interesting. Let's start with the big picture, if I may, Guntram, if you allow me, because you said, a series of transformations that allowed us to go from a rules-based system to a political order. Can you dwell a little bit on this? Obviously, it's a lot more grander. If you go to a new political order, you're not talking only about piecemeal changes that need to happen. You need to talk about a governance framework that needs to accompany the new political order. You need to talk about a new narrative, if I may call it this way. Have the citizens in Europe caught up with this drastic change from a rules-based system to a new political order?
Well, I think they have, and maybe to some extent even sometimes before the politicians. I think the public has been picking up that Europe was changing ever since the 1990s and early 2000s, and that the European Union was becoming more political. But maybe I should briefly zoom out and very succinctly present. And of course, it's going to be a little bit black and white terms, and reality is always more nuanced. But I think you could say that initially, the EU was really built on the model of what you could call depoliticization. And it was a very strong proposal, obviously, in the immediate post-war years, to say there has been too much passion and emotion in interstate relations on the European continent, and we're going to take the passion out. And we're going to transform all conflicts into problems, and problems we can solve. Right? And that can be technical, bureaucratic, and market building was the key to that approach. And it has, I would say, three features, which are qualities, but which can also turn into weaknesses at times of crisis. The first feature is that it takes time to build a regulatory framework. And that's good, because that allows to bring together all stakeholders, to be prudent and precise, etc. But in times of crisis, there are moments when you cannot take years between the European Commission here in Brussels, starting with a green paper, a white paper, a proposal going to Parliament, to the Council, etc. And that may take 5 to 7 years before it then ends up as actual legislation. Whereas, and you remember these moments as vividly as I do, when Greece risked going bankrupt, if not within the space of 72 hours, more than 500 billion euros was found. Or when you have thousands of refugees at your border, or when Brexit happened, or things like that, or like what we are witnessing now at the Polish-Belarusian border, you need speed, right? And that requires indeed a different governance framework to some extent. But what also changes, and I put a lot of emphasis on it in the book, is the experience of citizens, the way European politics is perceived. And again, maybe it's a cliche, but in the old days, normal people, citizens, were supposed to be not interested really in what was happening, was supposed to be boring. Political scientists call this the permissive consensus, which was the way people looked at EU or community politics, basically a kind of polite indifference with some jokes about cucumbers and bananas and city rules, etc. But basically, okay, let them go on and build that. Whereas what we're doing in the past 15 years as European Union is obviously much more salient, to use another political science term, in the sense that it really matters more intensely sometimes for people's daily lives, for their taxes, but also for their views on issues of identity, solidarity, sovereignty. Think of the migration crisis, Brexit. So it's much more part of political life. European issues have become part of national elections, many leaders have been voted out of office or into office because of their European proposals, which was something which happened not at all, was supposed not to happen in the early days. And the pandemic basically is further accelerating this trend or this metamorphosis, which I'm seeing.
Perhaps to push you a little bit further on the sort of idea of a new political entity emerging and confronting you with a frequent criticism that, of course, Brussels is faced with up to now, which is basically that Brussels is very technocratic and lacks democratic legitimacy. Now, when you sort of look at the pandemic response, and we want to focus here more on your book, which looks at the last 2 years, who were really, in your view, the actors that moved forward on the pandemic response, and based on what kind of legitimacy? Perhaps to recall for our listeners the main sort of big decision blocks. I mean, where of course there was the ECB response, which was very strong and early and quick and very important. But then very soon was the very important decision to create a European Recovery Fund. And then, of course, the decision only shortly after to joint purchases of vaccines. And all of that essentially happening in the first half of 2020. But, who were really the actors behind in your reading, and based on what legitimacy did they take these decisions?
Thank you, Gunther, for that question. And it basically brings to the third difference between the old rules politics and the new events politics. And that is a change of political caste, or at least, let's say, a change of the center of gravity. To the extent that in crisis politics, more than in day-to-day politics, it is national leaders in their European capacity which step forward. It is the European Council with a few important members, which often takes the lead. When a crisis erupts, people in Europe will ask, what will Chancellor Merkel say, now that she's still here? What will the French president, but also what will the Commission president, a member of the European Council also, what will the president of the European Council, depending on the circumstances, the president of ECB, Prime Minister of Italy, sometimes the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, 6, 7 political actors in various European and national capacities. That's persons of whom some kind of leadership or a sense of proposals is expected. Now, it so happens they meet in this body, the European Council, which then becomes center stage. Now, in terms of legitimacy, it's not a straightforward situation, obviously. It's a bit national leaders. Well, let's take Merkel. We should say more about her role in this crisis. She's accountable to the Bundestag in Germany. Macron to his voters, hardly to parliament. In the case of France, Commission president has also democratic accountability to the European Parliament. So it's a bit of a bric-a-brac. It's a sort of combination of individual legitimacies. The ECB, or the ECB as such, well, is at least pretending to have technocratic mandate on the basis of which it has a certain leeway to intervene. So there's a whole debate beneath there. But let's say personally, I'm not scandalized that in a situation which affects all our societies of every single EU member state, and where there is a realization, perhaps even stronger than in previous crises, that what happens in the country next door also matters to you, that there is a strong role for presidents and prime ministers in tackling that crisis collectively, and in an interplay, which in this crisis has been, I think, well executed, with, in particular, the Commission and the Commission president. Now, if you want to single out individual actors, I think Angela Merkel is once again, and probably for the last time, center stage here. In my view, it was her decision somewhere in April, May 2020 to change camps in the old debate about the future of economic monetary union, about solidarity and discipline. She changed camps and she moved from the north from the euro crisis to the center, leaving her former northern allies a bit alone, like the Netherlands and Austria, etc. Because Merkel, and she did this, I researched this, and well, you've read about it as well, in a way it was a personal decision really of the Chancellor herself to say, well, in this crisis, Germany cannot be the Scrooge again of the story, like in the euro crisis, where we only say no and we impose very strong conditions and austerity measures, etc., on countries in need. And this is why she entered a very important deal with French President Macron. They announced it on 18th of May 2020. And that paved the way for the Commission and for Commission President Ursula von der Leyen 10 days later to present formally the proposal for the EU Corona Recovery Fund.
Why did she change camps?
I think she realized that in this crisis, the human suffering was simply too big. And it was a matter of life and death. I think she had the prime ministers of Italy and Spain visiting her, or maybe at the time they couldn't because of lockdowns, but calling her, imploring her basically, my people, they are dying. And she very carefully has framed it and systematically as an exceptional situation. An exceptional situation and a symmetric shock, also in more technical terms. That is to say, nobody really was to blame, which, at least for a German audience, should signal a difference with the, for instance, euro crisis, where, and I know among economists we can talk a very long time about it, but in any case, there's also the aspects of perhaps a lack of reforms in Italy, too much spending in Greece, etc. Whereas here, it was clear to every single citizen that this could have happened everywhere and that you couldn't blame Italy for the outbreak. So maybe to sum it up, she felt also the resentment of the euro crisis. She felt still the lingering anger and bitterness in Southern Europe about the way they had been treated by Germany 10 years ago, and she didn't want to repeat it, at least not in this situation. And what is almost as striking, she immediately convinced the whole German political class.
Exactly.
They all fell in line within days. Even Wolfgang Schäuble, the bogeyman of Southern Europe for years, within 2 days after her proposal, he went out and said, no, we absolutely, this needs to be unconditional. We have to give grants and not loans again. Because loans, and Schäuble, funnily, he even used biblical language, if you remember, loans would be like stones. Instead of what we need is bread. So it's very Old Testamentical by the old man there.
But if I may, just to understand this point, because you spend a lot of time talking about this actually in the book, but I think it's not just the nature of the crisis, which is, it's a health crisis, it's exogenous, nobody's to blame. It's also a past, which is trying to correct for. That's what you just said, right?
Well, yeah, you could say correct for, but basically it's drawing the lessons from the past. It's the combination of a word I use, and I've taken it from a great German historian, is that these are layers of time, experiences which are, as it were, sedimenting and which are one after the other. And in this crisis, a lot came together. The euro crisis experience, to some extent also the migration crisis with closed borders, etc. And I think people sometimes underestimate the way political leaders have an intimate connection with public opinion, at least at home. This tends to be underestimated even by some of their advisors. I noticed when I was in the business myself. But the role of media, of the press, and what happened in the pandemic, and which did not happen to the same extent before, is that there was really a pan-European debate. And it was striking that Italian local politicians and mayors were buying advertisement space in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, basically to appeal directly to the German public to support them. And likewise, Italian Prime Minister Conte went on German and Dutch television and vice versa. So there was, as a result of this very surprising, shocking experience, a realization, at least briefly, that this pandemic was something which affected us all as Europeans. And that's why I spent a lot of time with it, because the political response, in a way, was a translation of this realization. And it came after the public call for action. It came after for help and solidarity. And that's the first time.
I think I very much agree with the point you make about essentially the human suffering being absolutely crucial for getting the political support. I think the backdrop of the Eurozone crisis, of course, meant that there was a better intellectual understanding about fiscal consolidation and the importance of fiscal support. I mean, that is very clear. Also in the German academic debate, there was much more understanding of these issues. But at the end of the day, I'm convinced Merkel could only carry the support of her voters with her because of essentially the dead bodies. And as someone said, only over a dead body will we get something that looks like a fiscal transfer mechanism. Well, here we had the dead bodies. And so it actually happened because of that. So I quite agree with that. Now, I guess the question I would have to you, which is perhaps a more difficult question for you, is, I mean, that human suffering was not only seen in Germany, it was also seen in the Netherlands and elsewhere, but their public opinion didn't quite swing as much, and also political leaders didn't do it. So why is that? Why do we see this difference between, let's say, the Dutch Prime Minister and the German Chancellor? How do you explain that?
Well, yeah, that's a very good question, and it's not that difficult, don't worry. Well, let's indeed take the Dutch example, because I'm Dutch, so I know that political scene rather well. They didn't immediately see that wider European debate. And the worst moment is when Dutch Finance Minister Wopke Hoekstra asked in a ECOFIN meeting to the Commission whether the Commission could do a report or an evaluation about the lack of financial buffers in countries like Italy and Spain, at the moment when hundreds or thousands of people were dying every day. So that was a complete lack of any empathy. And basically, he was playing for the galleries in the Netherlands, and he had maybe have got a little applause, but he had completely forgotten, let's say, the European wider political public sphere, which was also there, and which basically booed, and he had to disappear backstage. Well, Germany is a bigger member state than the Netherlands, so it feels more responsibility for the European Union as a whole and is ready to act upon it. And it is not excluded, by the way, that some in Germany would still backhandedly encourage the frugal states to keep firm. I mean, Germany likes to be in the middle. Chancellor Merkel likes to be in the center of the political debate. That's also how she operated both in Germany and in the EU. But basically what you see is a shift in the center of gravity of the rhetoric. In a way, you could say in the Euro crisis, there were two discourses colliding, a discourse of solidarity and a discourse focused on discipline or responsibility, or however you want to frame it. And the most important decisions, and you have analyzed them at Bruegel as well. Think about the banking union or of what the ECB did with OMT. Basically, there are a cocktail in all these cases of responsibility, more responsibility, supervision or whatever, and more solidarity. For instance, allowing the banks to use the ESM indirectly. In this crisis, basically, the rhetoric of solidarity was much stronger than the rhetoric of discipline. It was overpowered. And those who only framed their arguments in terms of discipline, like the Dutch finance minister whom I just mentioned, well, they didn't have a very strong position. And that's interesting, I think, because it really shows that it's not just a matter of power play and GDP, etc. It's also the quality of the arguments and whether an argument resonates or makes sense, which has an impact on the outcome in terms of political decisions for the European Union as a whole. And I find that a fascinating development, and it makes me also, let's say, less pessimistic about the responsiveness and including, to some extent, democratic responsiveness of the machinery.
If I may just take that a little bit further, because I think this is a very essential conversation, actually, particularly if you're interested in the future of Europe, whether the discourse is going to be one of solidarity or of self-interest. It strikes me that a discourse which bases the European Union on the principle of solidarity is going to create a lot of tensions, because you cannot sustain a European Union on solidarity. And of course, here comes the interesting, you can tell us a little bit your Dutch perspective on this. On the past 10 years, previous crises had always been about, yet again, solidarity. And when the real need for solidarity came, in 2020 with the dead bodies, it was impossible to sustain it in the Netherlands, or at least it took time to sustain it in the Netherlands. So, I think, have we understood that the European Union needs to be built on sort of interdependencies? It cannot be a solidarity. A sustainable European Union cannot be on solidarity. It actually damages the ability of the European Union to be solidar when it needs to be solidar.
Well, I think it also depends on how you frame it. I definitely think it makes sense to have elements of discipline in your economic policy. And also when we speak about solidarity, I wouldn't necessarily contrast it with self-interest. Because for many member states, solidarity is a matter of self-interest to the extent that they will be on the receiving end more than on the spending end of EU funds. So that's a little bit too easy, I would think. But I agree with you that in a way you cannot overload the expectations on what you want to achieve only in the name of solidarity. That is already very difficult in some cases, even at a national level. I live in Belgium, where they have, even between two parts of the countries, sometimes issues there, let alone at the European level. But nevertheless, in this case, the solidarity argument made sense. And I think maybe to also bring in the international dimension, what was perhaps helpful in this case is that European public opinion also realized that we were in this alone, as it were, as Europeans, without the United States, always the protector of Europe since 1945, or Western Europe at least, and Southern Europe. And at the same time, I think most people realized that this crisis simply was too big for a single state to deal with. The forces in play were too grand, and something like Europe had to act without people necessarily being clear in their minds which institution or whether member states, etc. But there was this idea that
Europe needs to act.
Europe needs to act.
But look, can I ask you about, since you started mentioning the international dimension, I mean, I think the first phase of the pandemic was this, if you remember, this period where there were aircrafts, planes flying in from Beijing to Italy or from Moscow to Italy, delivering medical goods. And then came the decision, and sort of people were saying, look, I mean, there's no plane from Germany, but there's one from China. And of course, that was never quite correct in the actual numbers, but the perception was definitely very much created like that. And then came the decision, well, we have to actually do this together. We have to buy vaccines together. We have to do joint purchase program. I think it's still in the public debate underestimated this moment. It was a huge decision that put a huge responsibility on the European institution and the European Commission in particular to do something that they had never done before and where they had no team for it, no preparation whatsoever. And much in contrast to what the United States did, where they had a running institution already, and that running institution had been mandated by President Trump several months earlier to do this purchase program and basically ensure that he gets reelected in the November 2020 election, which they didn't, fortunately, I guess. So the European Union starts late, has no preparation for this. And then comes the moment, early 21, where the vaccination delivery lags behind that of the UK and the US. And so that was quite a critical moment, and a moment that I have to say, I remember that moment very vividly as almost bigger threat to the EU at that stage. I perceived it than even the height of the Eurozone crisis, because it was, again, about life and death. So perhaps give us your take on this joint purchase program and how you see this, how did it roll out, the decision-making behind it?
I fully agree that this was an essential moment, and also that it was, well, I wouldn't say mishandled, but deeply underestimated by the European Commission, how important this was, and also what tensions it would bring and what public expectations it would bring. It goes back to where we started our conversation, and the perception of the public. This was really for the public a matter of life and death, because member states had mandated the Commission, somewhere backstage in June 2020, to get them out of the crisis, to buy the light at the end of the tunnel with these vaccines. Now, I've researched this a little bit in detail also on an earlier episode, because in March 2020, right at the time when the Chinese were indeed bringing face masks in particular to Italy, the Commission also did some public tendering to try and get face masks to Spain and Italy. And this utterly failed. Not a single company responded at the first public procurement. I must say this has been underreported. Was no news, but it was very telling, because what had happened is that the Commission was relying on the good old rules of the market, the price mechanism, in a medical pharmaceutical economy, which in March 2020 did not exist. In March 2020, there was a war economy in the field of medical and pharmaceutical products, which somebody like President Trump immediately understood. You will remember he invoked a clause or some legislation from the Korea War to nationalize, or at least to trigger General Motors into producing respirators, for instance. But in the Commission, and that's a little bit the Brussels worldview, it is very hard to get out of standard operating mode and to rely only on contracts, for instance. And I don't blame them for underestimating that the first time around, but I thought it was worse, therefore, that they made the same mistakes with the vaccines. Because by then they should have known that this was a war economy where you cannot rely on contracts, where it's important to produce on your own territory, to have at least a minimum of grip, where it's important to stress speed of delivery rather than price in the negotiation. So a number of elementary things which they have not all done. Also, member states let them do it. The German Council presidency, with the health minister Jens Spahn, who thinks of himself as a big man, but he didn't really look into it in depth either. And that cost, I think, indeed 6 weeks or 2 months of delay with the rollout of the vaccination campaign. And 6 weeks or 2 months, obviously, that means a lot more people dying and longer lockdowns and all the rest of it. When we look back, the delay has been caught up. The vaccination numbers in the EU overall are not worse than in the UK or in the US, definitely not. But the start was very tricky. And I hope next time around, when such a crisis hits, the EU institutions will realize, A, that we are in a war economy where different rules apply. Within the Commission, I think Commissioner Thierry Breton did realize this early on, but von der Leyen, for her, took more time, I would think. But also that public expectations will dramatically rise and politicians will be held accountable. The Commission is not really used to the same kind of public scrutiny, media scrutiny, as we know, and I've worked in The Hague, from a national political system where really the going gets much rougher. It's really nothing what you see here in the Berlaymont press conferences compared to what's happening in Berlin, Paris, Rome, wherever, when you have a political crisis. And I hope they will learn from this.
Can I add, if I may be a little bit provocative here, Guntram raised the issue of legitimacy earlier on. I mean, you're using language like we are in a war economy, but you're expecting an institution that actually doesn't necessarily have the legitimacy to address war-type problems. I would have thought that the national governments need to find a way of coordinating a war-type response and perhaps mandating it to the Commission or something else. But the idea that you can have the sovereign states being led by an institution of the Commission in a wartime type of environment, isn't that too much to ask?
Well, I mean, a few states exactly tried to do what you are suggesting, Maria. These were Germany, France, Italy, and the Netherlands. they pooled their resources together. This was late May, early June 2020. And they said, well, we will buy the vaccines, not only for the citizens of our 4 countries, but for the whole of EU. We will keep the Commission informed. And they were the 4 who concluded the first agreement with AstraZeneca. But when they came out early June 2020, there was a big uproar from the Commission, very disappointed. Von der Leyen was about to launch her own vaccine strategy, the European Parliament, also some smaller member states, including Belgium and others, who were afraid that they would be left out. So again, it was as a result of this pandemonium, if I may say so, at least of this public debate, then that Merkel, Macron, Conte still at the time, and Rutte probably decided, okay, well, let's drop this. Ursula can take on the job. Above all, in the light of what had happened in the 3 months earlier, all these North-South, very bitter disputes about financial solidarity, lack of unity, lack of solidarity. And EU leaders did not want to repeat that show of disunity, let's say, in a matter of life and death. And basically, they were hoping for the best by mandating the Commission. And that was not good enough. But they did realize, I think, that it was a tricky bet, because they had noticed, for instance, this face mask debacle. Maybe not the wider public, but the health ministry surely had an eye on that. So you're right to point to this tension and whether the Commission can deal with these state-like functions. But in the crisis situation, this is how the dilemma, in a way, was, well, not solved, but how one side of the dilemma was referred.
We are coming to the end of our podcast, but I do want to give you an opportunity to say perhaps a word about your last chapter, Geopolitics between China and the United States. So when I first saw the title there in the table of contents, I didn't fully understand how it fits to the rest. So perhaps you can just say very quickly something on that, and then we have to conclude the podcast.
Let's indeed conclude quickly. But basically, the point I'm making there is mostly about China, and that in the pandemic, and Guntram, you yourself mentioned the famous flight of the Red Cross airplanes landing in Rome in March 2020, China entered also the public sphere as a political actor for the European public at large. And maybe among experts, we had seen this Chinese tanker getting closer every day for the past 15 years or so. But now all of a sudden it was center stage. And also it seemed better organized than we were in the West. The United States at the same time looked awful, or even was to be pitied. So in a way, it put our mental map upside down. I mean, when we were kids, you and I, China was a third world country, let's face it. And the United States was high in the heaven up there for us in Europe. And here it was all upside down. And this forces, I think, a rethink and what happened. And that's why issues which are also dealing with at Bruegel, which have a direct economic policy impact, issues of strategic autonomy, the vulnerabilities of certain dependencies, all this is accelerating as a result of this experience, because it is more in the public eye than before that there are risks. So it has hit globalization. Now, these are just a few superficial words. And that's why what I do in the chapter is zooming really out. And we see China coming ever since the financial crisis, 2008, 2016, with interventions and very high-profile takeovers in German industry, for instance. But now in the pandemic, it's like a new stage of an awareness of the public and also of political leaders that we need to protect our way of living, the way we earn our money in Europe vis-a-vis China, but also at the same time that we can not only rely on the United States for that, as we have done in the past, since, and has been, it's more clear every day in a way, following Afghanistan and AUKUS and all the rest of it. For the United States, European interests are only their interests when they are American interests, to put it simply. That's a wake-up call, which follows also from the pandemonium, and which will bring us, no doubt, into the next chapter or next book. Who knows?
Can I just? I can't resist the temptation. Just if you allow me to ask this question, the document that the European Commission produced about where the issue of strategic autonomy became big, and also China, the way that Europe needs to think about China, the wake-up call, what you call, it says that China is a partner when it comes to climate, but it is a systemic rival when it comes to other issues. How can we think that we can cooperate with China on climate, but antagonize China on other issues and still achieve climate ambitions of the order of magnitude that we have?
Well, I think that is possible. But of course, China would have to agree as well.
You don't think China will use one to extract rents on the other?
Well, it shouldn't be too difficult. I tried a few times myself during a visit I made to Beijing to explain to Chinese interlocutors that basically the notion of systemic rivalry is a way to allow also a space for dialogue and cooperation. If you make it explicit, then it does not have to have an impact on all the rest. But I mean, this is perhaps a debate for another time.
Sure.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Luc von Middelaar has just published his book, Pandemonium, and we discussed it here in Bruegel's podcast, The Sound of Economics. If you like the conversation, please recommend it on your various social media feeds, and do come back, visit our website for research on all of these topics. And thank you again, Luc, and thank you, Maria, for this great conversation. Until next time, bye-bye.